Welcome. Welcome to the panel. Now we can get started. Here we are. And I'm so pleased to chair this tremendous panel of dedicated and idealistic individuals who've come here today to dialogue about their efforts to help build a great mass movement for peace and justice that can transform America and the world. They all are and have been intimately involved in the struggles of Ferguson and have carried their activism to other venues, including New York, some Baltimore, some Cleveland, and all around the country. But as I said, I first want to acknowledge someone who paved the way 50 years ago and helped build one of the greatest mass peace movements this country has ever known. Just earlier this month, in a Washington, D.C. conference titled Vietnam, The Power of Protest, he encouraged us to challenge the Pentagon on a battlefield of memory. He argued that to make sure our history is told accurately, we have to tell it ourselves. The parallels to our panelists and what we will be discussing today should become more and more evident. Since it was 50 years ago, on March 7th, 1965, that U.S. Marines landed in South Vietnam, marking the start of the U.S. ground war in Vietnam. That very same day, Alabama state troopers beat civil rights protesters in Selma, very same day. And weeks later, the first teach-in against the Vietnam War was held at the University of Michigan. Much has obviously changed in America since then, but much has obviously remained the same, or simply taken more sophisticated and nuanced forms of repression and domination. He also reminded us that it was the Vietnamese resistance and their sacrifice that led to our awakening as a country, along with the sacrifices of countless individuals in the civil rights movement at home. And that civil rights movement began mainly with handfuls of young people, black people, and students who led freedom rides and sit-ins. There had never been a peace movement like the one in 1965 that arose out of the civil rights movement that came weeks after Selma. At least 29 people would die at the hands of police while demonstrating for peace. But he also decried the fact that the counterculture, and most of us, eventually walked away from the struggle, my generation. He thought that it might have been otherwise if King or Bobby Kennedy had not been assassinated. We might have been united, at least for a moment, but we were relegated to wondering what might have been. We lost any basis for our unity, and thus we have not come together since that time. The question for us is whether today we can unify when we never could unify before. Can we do that for the memory of our movement and for the meaning that it holds for future generations? As some of you probably have guessed, I've been referring to Tom Hayden, a leader of Students for Democratic Society, SDS, who is one of the principal authors of the Port Huron Statement, written in 1962 when he was 22 years old. It laid the foundation for the New Left movement of the 60s, was a major force among the student anti-war civil rights and peace movements. Tom was part of a panel on transformative justice Tech and I were on last year at the forum. He was to have been at the plenary tonight, but he had a stroke several days ago. But his wife, Barbara, assures us that he's on the mend and deeply appreciates the love and support he's received. We know that Tom will be back with us very soon. He's here with us, in spirit, of course. Next year in the forum, certainly, long before that. So 50 years later, the links are still there that Tom identified and so many others, between a military-infused culture seeking to dominate through violence and fear, an economic system of greed, mendacity, and war profiteering, a racist new Jim Crow of unprecedented incarceration and police abuse and unaccountability, and a spiritual culture of apathy, moral bankruptcy, and selling out to the highest bidder. It's with this in mind that this panel comes together to help make the historical links of generational memory that Tom referred to remember and bear witness to the continuing events in Ferguson and around the country, and to strategize, to discuss how these experiences and memories can come together and pave the way for another and even greater mass movement for peace and justice. Now, as many of you know, these great mass movements don't occur overnight. They're very rare. It's not just a matter of a few charismatic leaders coming along who inspire, organize, and mobilize the tens and hundreds of thousands of people needed to bring about radical progressive change. Although, of course, these leaders are important. It's really built by the countless number of ordinary individuals, often unsung and unnamed. The everyday people immortalized in the music of Sly Stone, who stand up for what they believe is right and are willing to face the consequences. They are the ones who make the moral choices to the four questions the great African-American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois wrestled with. How does integrity face oppression? What does honesty do in the face of deception? What does decency do in the face of insult? And how does virtue meet brute force? For broad-based movements to succeed, they need to incorporate what many on the left and progressive circles have often failed to do. Acknowledge, as the Reverend William Barber of Moral Mondays has put it, the movement is about the moral fabric of our society, and we are called by a deeply moral and constitutional vision of what is possible. We look at public policy through a moral lens of justice for all and through the constitutional principle of governing for the good of us all. As an academic who's been around for a while, I can tell you, as I don't probably need to tell you, that for the most part, academics have been in a state of denial regarding these moral issues, utterly implicated and supporting the power structure, and as Noam Chomsky put it, interpreting historical events and formulating an ideology of social change that in part falsifies, in part restricts, and subverts that reality. Now, it's fairly obvious to see this when we see social science experts, criminologists, won't name institutions, but you can guess. Fairly close. Actually, right here. Okay, let's just spell it out. As they come out, as they have recently done, to question whether the police were already overburdened with paperwork and that the Justice Department was going too far in getting the Cleveland Police Department to follow some of the most exacting standards in the nation over how and when its officers can use force. I'm sure Reverend Sekou will have a couple of comments about that and the social science wisdom of that. It's less obvious when some of these experts advocate policies like situational crime prevention techniques and focused deterrence. a strategy of intervention that focuses criminal justice attention on a small number of chronically offending gang-involved youth. The use of drone flights in our wars on terror invites a suitable comparison to these criminal justice solutions to the problems of gang violence. And we should all know how that's been working, right? Why do we use violence or the threat of punishment and force against violent or would-be violent people to show them that violence is wrong? Even less obvious than the domestic drone-focused deterrence advocates, but still part of the new career mandarins, are the so-called humanist academics who say they're championing the cause of the disenfranchised through their critical advocacy, but aren't willing to put themselves or their careers on the line to truly support the groups they're writing about and academically profiting from. They've abdicated their moral role and offer no real transformative alternatives. As sociologist C. Wright Mills put it, above all else, do not give up your moral and political autonomy by accepting, in someone else's terms, the illiberal practicality of the bureaucratic ethos. That, thankfully, is not the case with each of our panelists. It's a panel I think will give Tom confidence that what might have been has a definite chance of still becoming. 50 years later, we trust that political and economic progressives have begun to understand that part of their tradition is one of prophetic spiritual progressivism that is needed to bring about the beloved community we all yearn for and talk about. It's the prophetic moral tradition of Buddha, Christ, Muhammad, King, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Dorothy Day, the Berrigan brothers, and their contemporary counterparts like Cornel West, Reverend Sekou, James Forbes, Reverend James Barber, Dr. James Cone, Glenn Ford, Susanna Heschel, Reverend Steve Phelps, and Rabbi Michael Lerner. We need the plain moral language of a Tom Hayden when he unequivocally and unambiguously states the Vietnam War was wrong and the peace movement was right. We need to resist the co-optation of that truth by the powers that seek to obfuscate, keep us divided, and pit us against each other, against our common interests. We need the prophetic academic activists like psychiatrist Dr. James Gilligan, who calls for the end of punishment in our criminal justice system and the development of therapeutic communities, of restorative healing, an end to the humiliation and shame so prevalent in our system. We need activists, academic activists like neuroscientist and drug researcher Carl Hart, the first tenured African-American in the sciences at Columbia University, who is fighting to end the drug war, advocating a decriminalization of all illicit drugs. By the way, he was told not to take up that cause by some of his academic colleagues at Columbia, who said he should wait until he received a full professorship. Carl wisely and thankfully didn't take their advice. It's about radical love, and those progressives out there who still don't get that are missing a big part of what it really means to be a progressive. It was a big part of the 60s, the time of the last great wave of progressive peace and justice movements, Woodstock, the San Francisco Summer of Love. Reflected in the music of the times, Motown, Bob Marley, Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, and countless others. There were excesses, of course, but fundamentally they got it right. Give peace a chance. Imagine, remember, All you need is love. Today, we need and thankfully have the musical poets and troubadours like Felipe, who carries on that tradition like no one else today. We need and thankfully have the storytellers and documentarians like Sabaah, whose forthcoming film, Whose Streets, will be coming out this summer. We need and thankfully have the next generation of champions of the civil rights movement like Tamika, who has been called the sojourner truth of her time. We need and thankfully have the new generation of theology liberation seminarians like Danny, who will become part of the next wave of Sloan Coffins. We need and thankfully have the new generation of great organizers like Carmen, who has been crossing the country and globe as executive director of the Gathering for Justice, mobilizing huge masses of marginalized communities in nonviolent settings. We need and thankfully have the great journalists and purveyors of information that keep the truth intact, like Leslie, through her founding and running of the Ferguson Response Network. And we need and thankfully have the activist prophetic ministers within the King tradition, like Reverend Sekou, who on behalf of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the country's oldest interfaith peace organization, went to Ferguson to organize alongside local and national groups. He's the subject of the iconic photo, which we passed out here among the bios, showing him kneeling in prayer, standing up to the state troopers and police in Ferguson. Maybe Reverend Sekou will talk about the next set of pictures when he took out, right, the slingshot and subdued those military forces against him. You remember that, right? He disarmed them, the David against the Ferguson police. And he answers the boys' questions. How does virtue meet brute force? How does integrity face oppression? So let's turn to our panel. They do get this. Just a second. Let's talk about Ferguson. What's going on there? Lessons to be learned, strategies, where we can go from here. Building that broad-based movement, Reverend Barber talks about a transformative fusion coalition, people of all faiths and those not of faith, but who believe in a moral universe. A movement that's indigenously led, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, where the agenda is hope, not fear, where relationships are transformative and long-term, not transactional or utilitarian. A movement that understands the connection between the issues that each partner focuses on, enabling us to embrace them as our own. Then we'll fully understand the Old Testament narrative to love the stranger, to love the other. A commandment that is the most repeated one in the entire Old Testament. And you're familiar, if you are familiar with that historical narrative, you're aware that Christ, as a Palestinian Jew, lived and died as a rabbi within that prophetic Orthodox Old Testament tradition. A revolutionary figure challenging the dominant secular leaders and false prophets of his day through his revolutionary love. Forward together, not one step back, as James Barber speaks. Let's finish the job Tom was talking about and praying for. Thank you. So, you have the bios. I'm not going to have a whole big, long discussion of that. Let's turn directly to our first speaker, Danny, Union Theological Seminary.
Hello. Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Good. Good afternoon. My name is Danny. Very grateful to be here. And I guess I just want to start by acknowledging something that's important to me that kind of came up when I even saw the title of the panel, Faces and Voices of the movement, is to recognize that pretty much anyone in this audience who's been involved in the movement could be up here and be one of these panelists. I just really want to recognize that, acknowledge that if you've been involved in the movement, I think you'd agree with me that this is not a movement led by quote-unquote experts. If you've been at this conference, a bunch of panels, you've probably listened to a lot of experts on their various fields, but this movement hasn't been led by experts or it's very grassroots. So I just wanted to recognize that. So I don't speak as an expert, but just as someone who saw just through the TV, the indignity that Mike Brown faced, being left on the street, and then hearing his mother's cries, and then the community's cries, and then the slap in the face the next day and the next few weeks, and then also being inspired by the people's resistance to that, where they finally said no. And then I was very much moved by that, and I can very authentically say that my life has been changed because of that in a very big way. So I speak, I guess, from that perspective. And so being that I am at Union, this is a very broad topic, Ferguson. I'm very excited to hear what other panelists are gonna say. I guess the message, I'm just gonna speak from my perspective, which is very much based in my faith, which has a Christian sort of background, but it's also agnostic interfaith. And one of the things that I've learned since about August, really being more involved in this movement, is I have a yearning for addressing part of the problem, which, when we're talking about the Ferguson movement, of course, we're talking about anti-Black state violence, police brutality, and other forms of oppression, but that's kind of the concrete thing. And for me, I really do feel that this is a problem of deep conscience and spirituality. And so my hope and the message that I'll try to communicate over the next just few minutes is that the movement, part of it, that we start to create institutions that replace religious institutions. And by replace, I mean that create sacred and sacramental spaces where we maybe learn from some of the churches or different religions, some of the ways that they build community, some of the ways that they feed people's souls and spirits, and we need that in the movement. I've been involved in spaces at seminary or churches where you'll have people go to communities of faith and they'll say things like, well, if we don't care about justice, who will? And I just think that's so arrogant for these religious people to say that, because pretty much I feel like the people have already answered that question to religious people when they ask that question. Actually, the people are already caring about faith and about justice for the oppressed. What my heart or my passion is to talk to be it the left or just the movement, which obviously will tend to be left, and to say we need a faith and spirituality, which is not to say that we need religion, but we do need a way to feed our spirits, to have rituals and sacraments. And I'll just give an example from my own experience in the movement. So I've been at Union Seminary for a couple years, born and raised in Chicago. Early on, got addicted to drugs, have a crazy life story, which I won't get into, but I'm formerly incarcerated, have been through the system, and through a big turn of events, after I was 25, got into a religious program, turned my life around, all of that, went off to college, and so I was at Union, and I saw this happen, and I went to Ferguson for Ferguson October, which I hope a good amount of you are familiar with. It was in October, a bunch of people converged, and there was a protest at the Ferguson Police Department. And it was a bunch of people from Ferguson, a bunch of people from, across the country, and we're at the Ferguson PD, and some people were doing civil disobedience, and we all go up, and then there was a lot of rain pouring down, and people are protesting. We had our hands up, doing all that, different chants. And then someone, I don't know if you know who Reverend Renita Lampkin is. She's a a pastor in the AME church down there, has been on the streets. She started chanting, "No more blood, no more blood." And I started chanting that. And then all of a sudden, with the rain and everything, I just started I broke down crying, because it just in my spirit, I got a flash of Mike Brown's body, and I heard, and recalling his mother weeping, and lamenting, do you know how hard it was to get him to graduate? And feeling that, and then all of a sudden I had an image of my brother, and I could imagine what I would feel like if my brother was killed. And then I sort of started imagining what it would feel like if, how my mother would feel if I was killed. And that made me, I had never met Mike Brown, but at that moment I felt this sort of, the empathy, it was there, that moved me. And that's what, I was already politically active and all of that before, and cared about social justice, but since then it's been sort of this nonstop, I can't sleep, need to be on the streets and protesting and being in community that's struggling. And I think what happened to me, and what I think happens at protests is it's something religious, or something spiritual, something faith-based, something deeper than just what we sense with our five senses, something happening on a deeper level. And I guess we don't talk about it as much. I think on the left sometimes there is a very healthy, a justifiable skepticism of religion, because religion has done a lot of bad things. But I also think maybe sometimes we've gone too far, and we're not developing the language and the theory and the framework so that we can actually, something powerful happened at that protest for me. And I know that similar things have happened to others, but these things just sort of happen and then they sort of pass, at least in my experience in the movement. And so my hope is that we begin to cultivate that, because I think that's where a lot of surplus energy can be created, where people can, where basically what I think happens at churches is, people come together, and it's for a mass collective affirmation of our ideals. So when we come together and we say no justice, no peace, or Black Lives Matter, those are our hymns. Those become doctrines, they become sacred. People say that, and people who are in that protest, that becomes an ideal that we're putting out and hopefully living or attempting to. And so I guess I'm just gonna stay focused on that, I guess. I haven't seen that. I guess I'm trying to work towards that. Hopefully I'll be in St. Louis over the summer, working with grassroots activists and trying to see how we can create an institution that's something like the church, that brings people together regularly, not just for protests, but to build community and to also talk about these things on a deeper level. And all of that is focused on, I guess the strategy for me is not so much appealing to power or trying to get legislation passed or anything like that, because I don't really have any faith in all of that, but in increasing the power of the people. And one of those aspects is increasing their spiritual power, because then they become emboldened and then we can fight. So yeah, that's all.
Hi everyone, how are you guys? Good. Okay, so I guess I'll just jump right in. I went to Ferguson, having graduated from Columbia, pre-med, and was sort of trying to find my way working for a nonprofit. And it was between jobs, and Ferguson had happened, and I'd been tweeting about it, Facebooking about it, and then an opportunity came for me to go, and I felt so pulled, I felt so moved. I felt like, because I talked about all these things on social media, that I had a responsibility to go there and actually stand with people who were standing up for what was right. And when I got there, I was so surprised and so humbled by what I found, because There wasn't a lot of people on podiums. There weren't a lot of, it wasn't a glamorous thing. I didn't see a lot of the rioting and the looting and the things that I saw on TV, but what I did see was people just loving each other in a real tangible way. And it didn't matter who you were. It didn't even matter what you looked like. I stayed in the home of a wonderful woman named Margaret Phillips. She was a classics professor at Washington University.
Wow.
She opened her home to, dozens of activists over the course of months. Easily 100 people, maybe more, had stayed in her home just because she had the space. She had no obligation. There was no real reason for her to take that risk. But she opened her home. I was fed. I got transportation, all of these things with virtually no money. And so I think somehow in the process of just standing up for what was right, that moment, particularly when it was at its most intense, I think people actually began to model the way we should be treating each other, the way we should be watching each other's backs, the way we should be sharing if we have more than we need at the moment. And that really inspired me, and it got me to thinking about what is my responsibility now. Because I came from New York, it wasn't my hometown, it wasn't my city, it wasn't my neighborhood, it wasn't the people that I had grown up with for years. So I sort of felt tentative, like, should I be running out into the street? Should I start a chant? Should I not? Where do I really fit in? And that's when I decided to work on this documentary. I thought, I can stand with people, I can put my body on the line, and I can also bear witness and make sure that I can take this story back to where I'm from and to the people that I know, and make sure that it's not forgotten, and make sure that the truth is told. Because anybody who is out there, or if you've ever been at a protest and seen it on the news, they lie. It's not even gray, like they just flat out lie to the majority of America about what goes on in those moments. And so that's something that I'm really passionate about, just telling the truth, just being really honest and really clear about what we're facing, because, just like Jesus, and I'm not religious, but I have a profound respect for spirituality and people who practice it. And just like Jesus, Mike Brown was a man of color who was murdered by the state. And all of us with brown skin are subject to that. Really, that can be done to us with impunity at any time. And this is 2015, where we're supposed to be, well beyond that kind of barbaric treatment of other human beings based on something as flimsy as skin color. So it's just important for me to remember that lesson, and to remember in the process of fighting for justice, in the process of demanding what's right, that's when we have the opportunity to show love and to model the things that we want to see. And I think about this panel. When I first heard about it, there's a registration fee, which is necessary. It takes money to put on a panel, but that means that those of us who are in this room had the ability to pay for that, which means that we now have a responsibility to take this information and bring it to people who might not have had that access or might not have had that ability. And we have to be really conscious of that. We got to be really conscious about not preaching to the choir, about not excluding certain people. Trans and queer people made up so much of those front lines, took so many chances with their lives for this cause, and sometimes didn't even get the support of the movement, which was heartbreaking. We have to remember indigenous people. We have to always remember that we are on stolen land. And even those of us who are people of color who are fighting for our freedom here have to think about our relationship to this land. So yeah, those are my words. Hopefully we can talk more later.
Hey everyone, how are you? So my portal into the movement, so to speak, came out of Ferguson, obviously, and it really was born out of a conversation I had with a group of clergy in the St. Louis area. I was on a conference call with them, just listening to what was going on with them and putting together some materials to distribute through my faith, which is Unitarian Universalism. We were putting together worship documents for people to talk to their congregations about what was going on in Ferguson and what they could do to help, and also things for youth, for religious education, how they can talk to the young people in each of the congregations. And as we were heading towards the grand jury announcement, I just asked a very simple question, you know, what can people do around the country? Do you guys want people to do solidarity action? What do you guys want? And I got a resounding, yeah, we really can't think about that right now. And I really appreciated it. It was a profound moment for me because I had to understand that they really were dealing with so much on the ground. They had to be focused on their community. They had to be focused on all the things that they had to do to prepare themselves. They were doing direct action training. They were doing de-escalation training. They were doing so much at that moment, and it really wasn't their responsibility to worry about what everybody else was doing. So I had this idea. I called about 20 organizers I knew across the country, and I said, hey, why don't we decide we're gonna do something? Whenever the grand jury announcement comes out, we'll time it based on that, and I'll throw up a tumbler and we'll just invite people to do the same thing. And I had the idea for 3 reasons. One is I really wanted a place to port people in so that no matter what city you were in, you could say, hey, I'm gonna do something, even if it's just 6 of us standing on a corner, we're part of this, and we are standing up and saying that we don't think this is right. The second thing was to connect people. So if you were in your area and you hadn't ever gone to an action, this was a place you can say, okay, people are gonna be coalescing at this area on this date and I can come in. And the third thing, which actually speaks, you mentioned journalism, which is my background, was to have some tangible numbers about how large the response was gonna be. Because it's been my experience that whatever the response is, the official counts are usually 50% of what the reality comes to. And I wanted a place to say, nope, 117 cities on the day that the announcement came had actions. There's no questioning it, there's nobody that can say that didn't happen. These things occurred. And so those were my 3 reasons for putting the Ferguson Response Network together, just generally speaking. And since then, it's been a really profound experience for me to talk with so many organizers across the country as we've continued to document and list actions that go on across the country. We just listed, I think, over 1,500 actions since the grand jury announcement nationwide. So this is a perpetual, constant movement. There is not a day that has gone by since then that at least 1 to 2 actions aren't happening on any given day. As far away as Honolulu, as close as Baltimore, in Anchorage, Alaska, in Topeka, Kansas. There is not an area of this country that has not felt moved by what's been going on. And so that's really what I seek to do, which is amplify people's actions and to let people have a place that they can port in and get this information. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was, you mentioned those couple of questions. How does integrity face oppression and decency versus insult, and virtue versus brute force? And for me, I have heard through the movement and through the people I work with that a resounding answer is no more. That's the answer that is given by decency, by virtue, by integrity. We say no more to all of those things that we fight. And it is really important that we don't use the tools of the oppressor to do that. And that's part of where the integrity and the decency and the virtue come in. And then the last thing that it's done for me is really caused me to question the anti-Black conditioning in our society and what that means to me as an individual, as a Black woman, and to question almost everything that I thought was true. I was recently on the March for Justice with Tamika and Carmen. Thankfully had an amazing experience, but was in a space where it was unusual for me. I was an elder in that space. And it caused me to really question so much about the things I had been taught and why I believe those things. So when people ask me what they can do, I always say, challenge the institutions that you are a part of, question everything that you have known up until this point, and do your best to connect with as many people as you can. So I'll start there. You guys can.
First and foremost, I want to say good evening to the choir. I'm glad that everyone could make it to church today. This is obviously a metaphor for one of the things I want to talk about, which is spirituality leading people towards the movement. For a long time, I think it was touched upon very briefly, and we talked about it. But there's always been this sort of narrative that if you have any sort of leftist leaning, you must be an atheist. You must be a person that doesn't believe in God. You know what? You know what people who don't believe in God do? They genetically create seeds or vegetables that don't give seeds. You know, people who don't believe in God do things like replace your food with GMO and refuse to tell you if it's in there or not. People who don't believe in God do things like war and genocide and kill people by the millions. So if it's within my power during the day to speak to someone who doesn't believe in God, who doesn't want to invade and occupy other people's countries, who has no interest in enslaving other people, I'd love that conversation. I think that for me, my personal experience in the movement comes from just coming to America. You know, I wasn't born in this country. I was born in South America, in Peru. And at that particular time in the late 70s, there was a war between a faction of leftist guerrillas, the Maoist influence. They called themselves the Shining Path, right? And then the MRTA. And on the other side was the CIA-sponsored government troops and their paramilitary guerrillas. And the government didn't want the world, and especially its own citizens, to know that the United States had participated in helping and aiding these people. So the paratroopers at the end of all their wonderful parades would never be allowed to march with all the other troops. My father told me that there was also a 1,200% interest every year. So if you can imagine $10 becoming $1 next week, becoming 10 cents, becoming 1 cent, and then becoming completely useless. And my father decided to move us out of this lunacy and violence and economic downturn to Harlem in the 1980s so that we could find peace and stability. But what I did find was I found a city that was still alive with the last vestiges of what New York really was in the 80s and 90s, where people came out, and believe me, I just walking around Harlem and talking to people, just existing in this city, gave me the introduction to police brutality and to racism, to all of these things that we're talking about today. My first encounter with the police is indicative of this. You know, we were at a place called Grant's Tomb, where they have all these parties. In the summers, they used to have jazz festivals. So jazz musicians from all over the world, from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, from America used to come there. We raced one time, down the block. You know, race, I think I'm faster than you. You know, that shit that adults don't do to one another anymore. I could beat you to the end of the block, man. I'll bet you an ice cream cone. It wasn't, we were 10 years old, 11 years old. We ran to the edge of the block. My heart's pumping out of my chest. I finally think I won something, which I haven't won a damn thing, you know what I mean? So I get to the end, all of a sudden a police car jumps the curb, runs damn near into my friend, who's got to be 12 years old at the time. And the guy pulls out on us, and my other friend just pretends, he tries to act like he's not with us. I always make fun of him because of this. I'm like, man, why you act like he wasn't with us, man? Like they wasn't gonna come find you and stop you, and they just thought you were a random individual that just happened to be with them. But they stopped and they brought him back. They brought me back. I had my hands up. This is the part where it relates to what we're talking about. I had my hands in the air. I'm like, wait a minute, I didn't do anything. Mind you, my young mind, I'm 11 years old, 12 years old. I'm like, I didn't do anything. Why am I being stopped? What's the purpose of this? They're all, I read Jane and Spot ran up the hill, the little white faces. Nobody arrested these little kids in the book for running around. The little prince is on a planet by himself. What the fuck? Jumped the curb and said, what did you guys steal? And I said, wait, what are you talking about? What did we steal? We didn't steal anything, you know? My father used to teach in a military academy. So I said, officer, sir, we haven't robbed anybody. We didn't steal anything. We haven't erased. And the guy looked at me in the face and he goes, the only reason that niggers and spics run is when they've stolen something. And looking at this, I didn't know what to say as a child, but as an adult, I realized that this type of person are the type of people that have power, and they're the people that are at the minimal position of interaction. In other words, if you want to keep fighting the pawns in chess all day, if you want to keep trading rook for pawn, bishop for pawn, knight for pawn, queen for pawn, then keep fighting the police all day. Because that's all you're going to be fighting, the pawns of the system. Obviously not the people who designed the policy, obviously not the people who understand what all this would have caused. And I also felt sorry for his children. Do you know why? Because the first victim of racism is a racist child. That poor child doesn't know any better. I remember in my own elementary school, there was a teacher that told, I don't know why she picked my mom and my dad to say this, she told us in 6th grade that there was no history of education in Africa before Rome and Greece. And if you can imagine 25 angry black and brown parents. And then, you know what they did? They called up all the white parents too and said, hey, how many of you have a degree in history and science? And about 10, 20 people raised their hand. And the next day, what they had was not just the angry black and brown faces. No, there was brown people, there was black people, there were Asian people, there were white people, Christian people, Jewish people, Muslim people. And then the school became terrified and fired this woman. And I make this point because recently I saw a film called Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. And inside that movie, they had a specific chapter about Fred Hampton. And something blew my mind about the conversation he was having. He was in a room with a group of people that he said, now these people are white people who live in a rural society, right? Poor, broke white people that I've decided to reach out to a coalition and work with. And the most interesting thing is he was having a friendly conversation between him and a group of Panthers and a room full of these rural Appalachian white people that lived in Pennsylvania. And I noticed something on the man's jacket. I noticed that on this white man's jacket, he had a jean jacket just like this woman is wearing, but there was a big Confederate flag, which she didn't wear today. So this huge Confederate flag that was just plastered right here. And I always remember, if I'm thinking in my head, man, if I was 10 years younger, I would ask, why didn't he just smack this dude in the face for wearing a Confederate flag? And then I realized what he was doing. He was taking the most complicated forms of things that are supposed to bother us about other people in the movement and saying, this isn't as important as the rest of this. I already know the history of this flag. You know, the way my OGs told me that I don't care, you want to wave that all day long. The most important Confederate flag is still the white flag of surrender when the Republic crushed you and brought you back into the fold. Right. Heartless, but true. And there's a historical analysis to go along with that as well, because if we were two countries, then Europe would have picked us apart, and one of us would be speaking French or Spanish right now. The reality is that in these cases where we find ourselves against or opposed, supposedly, to the system, we have to ask ourselves, who are our allies in this? You know? Some people say there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. That may be true when we're talking about economic endorsements. But if we're talking about the physical policy difference between people who have a progressive mind view and people who have a quote-unquote conservative mind view, which isn't even conservative anymore. It's not based on conservative economics. It's based on handing your position to the extremists in your party. And I always tell people, if you can't control your extremists, you are not a movement. If you are marching, you can't control people from breaking windows or kicking things down, even though they're agent provocateurs sent to do that, then that's what we need to focus on immediately. You know, one thing that hit my heart when I looked at this is that I realized too where a lot of my prejudices had come from. I needed to confront those things. I said, as black and brown people coming from a hip hop movement, where does the gender discrimination come in? Sexuality discrimination. And then I say, wait a minute, where does a lot of hip hop culture come from? It comes from prison culture. I can tell you exactly where my problems with sexuality began. When I rescued a young man who people were trying to violate in the shower. I said, that's not your decision to make. He's a boy. He's 18 years old. You can't just drag him in there and do what you want to do. That makes people standoffish. But when you look through history and you see the analogies that have been made about people, whether they're about people of color or people who are ambiguously heterosexual, all of these things are false. In hip hop, we don't call someone the F word, or we don't call someone gay because we want to say that they're having a relationship with a man. We say it because we say that a person is weak, unable to fight, incapable of standing up for themselves. And if you've looked through history, then some of the most ruthless conquerors in the world have been people who may have shared a bed with a man. So where's the reality in that? When people try to tell us about our history, about Marxism and left-wing thought, I say to myself, well, wow, I'm glad that Marx had a revelation and had the idea to go and collect all these other ideas, but as intelligent as he was, I'm afraid that the people who live in dark, ignorant South America and Africa, us in the jungles, I'm sorry, we didn't need to have the complex concept of sharing acted like it was some invention when it was brought to us. Our indigenous societies lived on this for years. And it's not just black and brown people. White people, European people, please research your history as well. You have plenty of tribes before English feudalism all over Europe that did not believe in the capitalistic expression of what feudalism became, because it naturally evolved into this. There is still an economic aristocracy that exists in America. Even if you don't call someone a count or a duke or a baron or a prince, believe me, when you go to court and they go to court, the experience is not the same. When you are arrested and they are arrested, the experience is not the same. I think, to close, because I really don't want to talk about this forever, and I can't, because we have so many other intelligent, incredible people. But I heard something. When the sister was saying about how it's 2015, the brother was saying 2015, we're still going through this. I asked myself, how are we supposed to be beyond this? When did the human race automatically evolve? At what point did we evolve? Was that during World War I? Was that during World War II that we evolved? Did we evolve after Vietnam? Did we evolve after that failed revolution that we call the Civil War in America? No, we didn't evolve. We've always been a ruthless people, but with a chance to have the most powerful thing that a human being can have, which is self-awareness, self-understanding. Not just knowledge of self, but also understanding the limitations that you have, the power that you have, being self-aware. Hey, listen, if you've had racist parents, you don't need to be like them. If you've had people that have molested people in your family, you don't need to be a child molester to be part of your family. And I want to say one final thing about violence. I went to a workshop, and I never forget this in my life. A dude said, I'm going to explain to you how revolution works. And he asked a young lady to come up. I'm not going to do it to this young lady because she doesn't know me, but it was a lady that he knew. And he asked her to come up, and he put his hands on her throat. And he goes, I'm gonna rape and kill this person. Can you stop me? He goes, tell me what non-violent options this woman has to stop me. And then little by little, his voice got louder. He goes, tell me, motherfucker, real loud. It scared people. But was he wrong? In order to get my hands off her throat that were choking her, the life out of her, someone needed to remove my hand. Asking me was not going to get me to remove my hand. Begging me was not going to get me to remove my hand. Passing a law 3,000 miles away to govern the land that I was sitting on while I was choking her was not going to get me to remove my hand. So it begs the question then, when is violence appropriate? At what point will it become appropriate? These are important things for us to talk about, especially within the confines of a peace movement. Is self-defense violence? If someone breaks into your home with a no-knock warrant and starts shooting the place up and you shoot back, we need to have more of those conversations because that is the future. Unfortunately, as the system gets more and more violent and people begin to react that way. I'm not saying that all of us should react that way, but make no mistake, eventually, can you imagine your child lying on a slab and someone giving you some ridiculous excuse? All revolutions start because of some personal thing that has been done to someone. Every catalyst for a revolution, even the ones that we don't hear about all the time. How about the Civil War in Spain between the fascist forces of Franco and the people trying to restore the Republic? When I first started reading about it, I said, well, what are the catalysts? And I remember reading one about a man whose daughter was raped. She was raped by soldiers of the Republic who now slipped into fascism. He said, man, I'm going to bring this person to justice. And when the witnesses, 12 witnesses for his daughter's rape were denied, he went in there and he started shooting up cops in the police station. This then became a landslide of anger, because guess what? She wasn't the only person's daughter who was raped in that police station. He wasn't the only person to ever have been served injustice. And that wasn't the only crime that they had cleaned up. So just imagine all the people that you read about ever in the movement, and I'm just going to close by saying that they weren't born and their parents said, oh, this is going to be a revolutionary. They were regular people that were going about their lives, and they saw something they could not turn away from. That's who you guys are. That's who we are. That's who revolutionaries are. They're people who saw injustice happening, and even though the people may not look like you or have anything to do with you, they said, no, that's wrong. I won't let that happen. I won't be there. And I can respect that, because I can't respect people who say, that's the way it's always been. That's the way it's always going to be. No, that's the way you made it, because you allow it to be that way. Thank you.